Hey y'all, this is Mr. Gonzalez, and this is the final installment in my 5-part lesson on the United States in World War II. In the last installment, I focused on American operations against Germany in the European theater. In this installment, I want to focus on operations against Japan in the Pacific theater. So let's go all the way back to the beginning of American involvement in the war. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, they crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and this essentially allowed the Japanese free reign of the Pacific Ocean. There was, for the moment, nobody in the Pacific who could stop the Japanese. So immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they went on to attack other U.S. and British bases, such as the Philippines, Wake Island, Midway Island, so on and so forth. But the attack that I really want to focus on is the attack on the Philippines. There was a 4-month battle that raged in the Philippines between the invading Japanese forces and the American and Filipino forces that were defending the islands. And the battle ended when President Roosevelt ordered the American commander, General Douglas MacArthur, to evacuate the island, and his men were left behind and had no choice but to surrender to the Japanese. Now, MacArthur was very upset that he had to leave his troops behind. He vowed that he would return. But his troops, some of them never forgave him for leaving them behind. Once they surrendered, they were forced to march to a prisoner of war camp, and this is remembered as the Bataan Death March. These poor prisoners had to walk 4 or 5 days to get to the prisoner of war camp. In some cases, they were packed into train cars, and it's estimated that several hundred of them died during the trip. After the war, the Japanese commander who was responsible for the death march was convicted of war crimes and was executed. So this is yet another example of Japanese war atrocities that really angered Americans back home. Over the course of the next couple of months, the Americans managed to stop the Japanese expansion into the Pacific. There was the Battle of the Coral Sea, and more important, the Battle of Midway. These are two important naval victories over Japanese forces, especially at the Battle of Midway. It's not known positively, but it's believed that had the Japanese won that battle, they may have attempted an invasion of Hawaii. But we turned back the Japanese, and starting after the Battle of Midway, we were able to focus on actually advancing toward the home islands of Japan. Here is a map. If you look at all the areas in red, these are areas that were either part of the Japanese Empire before the war or were conquered after the war broke out. For example, here are the Philippines, which had belonged to the United States. There's the Dutch East Indies, which the Japanese captured for their oil supply. You can see how close they are to the Philippines. And this red area represents the boundaries of the areas that have been conquered by the Japanese. Here is Midway Island. That is where a Japanese fleet was turned back, and let's move on from there. So slowly over the course of from August of 1942 through the summer of 1945, the American Marines slowly won back the territory that had been seized by the Japanese. And they used a tactic that is known as island hopping. They would capture an island, and then they would use that island as a base to attack another island. And once they captured that island, they would use it as a base to attack another. So they're using islands like they're stepping stones, and they're using them to slowly get closer and get closer and get closer to the home islands of Japan. You really don't need to know the details about these battles that I listed, but these are some of the more famous islands that were captured. The Battle of Guadalcanal was really the first example of the Americans retaking territory during the war against Japan. Peleliu was in 1944 and really represents a turning point in the war against Japan. At the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Japanese put up a fight for several months and then evacuated the island. On Peleliu, they literally fought to the death, and this is what you would see the Japanese do more or less up until the end of the war. At the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is what you see pictured here, that's where the famous photograph of the flag being raised was taken. Once again, the Japanese fought to the death. There was about 22,000 Japanese on the island of Iwo Jima, and only 216 actually surrendered. They literally fought almost to the man, to the death. And the Battle of Okinawa got the Americans right up to the back door of the Japanese home islands. As we drew closer and closer and closer to Japan, we were able to use the islands as Air Force bases and launch bombing campaigns against Japanese cities such as Tokyo and others. And the end of World War II, the dropping of the atomic bomb. Starting in 1941, scientists in the United States were working on what was called the Manhattan Project, and this was a project to develop an atomic bomb. Albert Einstein was involved in this, and what is interesting is he actually moved to the United States in 1933 to escape the Nazis. Robert Oppenheimer is another famous name that was involved in the Manhattan Project. And in July of 1945, they successfully exploded an atomic bomb in the desert outside of Los Alamos, New Mexico. By this point in time, the President of the United States was Harry S. Truman. Franklin D. Roosevelt had died of a stroke in Warm Springs, Georgia, in April of 1945. So now it was up to Harry S. Truman to make the decision, am I going to drop this atomic bomb on Japan, or am I going to launch a full-scale invasion? Well, the Japanese were growing more and more desperate. They were starting to use what were called kamikaze attacks, where they would literally put bombs in their planes and fly them in suicide attacks into American ships. He was receiving reports that thousands of Japanese pilots were being trained to do this, and that school children were being trained to fight the Americans. And it was estimated that if the United States invaded Japan, it would cost somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million lives, not counting the number of Japanese that would be killed. So Truman decided that more lives would probably be saved if he just used the atomic bomb. So on August 6th, 1945, the first atomic bomb ever used against an enemy in all of human history was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. And it was dropped by a B-29 nicknamed the Enola Gay. And it the photograph you see to the right is the effects. It killed thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. 3 days later, Truman ordered the dropping of a second bomb, this one on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, with similar effects. It has been suggested that Truman dropped a second bomb so quickly after the first just to send a message to the Soviet Union that he was willing to use atomic weapons, but that's something we'll get into in the next chapter. After having 2 atomic bombs dropped on them, the Japanese government decided that they had had enough, and on August 14th, 1945, they agreed to the American demand of unconditional surrender. And on September 2nd, 1945, the formal surrender document was signed on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor, and World War II officially came to an end.